Perfect. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to come today, and the chiefs and the old people and all the members from this area. Thank you for asking me to be here. I'm a little bit jet-lagged out. I just came back from Geneva on Sunday morning at 3 o'clock in the morning. So 7 o'clock at night, and I wake up at 4:15 like I did today. And so I'm ready to have a little nap now. But anyway, I'm not going to nap. We were in Geneva because Ermineskin, Onion Lake, and Sutuna filed a complaint at the Committee on the Rights of the Child about the legislation on child welfare, that it discriminates against Indigenous peoples, it didn't protect our right to free, prior, and informed consent, and that the embedding within the legislation the concept of the rights of the child, which the Committee on the Rights of the Child have said that this is a racist colonial concept, because the rights of the child concept is embedded within the colonial framework, and it can't be embedded in the colonial framework. It should be embedded within our Indigenous culture, within our Indigenous collective right. So we were there, there's a complaint filed, and we were able to talk to some people about what that means. As you know, Canada has this interesting, I don't know, I guess because they spend a lot of money, but they have this idea that the UN people, some of the people in the UN system think that Canada is a great place, that everything is good in Canada, all the streets are paved in gold and all the Indians are happy. So they're kind of shocked to hear that that's not what the reality is. And then Canada, of course, doesn't answer any of the questions that the United Nations poses in relation to Indigenous people or children. Like, the UN system was shocked to hear that there are more children in care now than there were during the residential school time. The legislation that they've now passed, the nations, you're never going to get control of your children, because you're going to have a whole team that you're going to have constantly negotiating with all the jurisdictions on those agreements that you need to have in order to retrieve your children. So they've set it up to support themselves. Child welfare is a growth industry for the non-Indigenous people in this country, as you're well aware of that. Everybody who knows works in this area. But that's what we're doing in Geneva. Just for the guy from Indian Affairs there. We didn't spend any federal money to go to Geneva, just for your records, in case you try to say that over there. Because they have said that. They've sent people from Indian Affairs to Geneva who said that we all have Mercedes-Benzes parked behind the teepees. This is reported in the media in Europe. So just, that's the kind of stuff they say. So, but I don't talk about that because there's too many ugly stories. But let's talk about the treaty. So at the time, this is the day before the treaty. Okay, there's two separate jurisdictions here. There's us over here on the TP side, and then over here is the Crown that represented the Queen in right of Great Britain and Ireland. I was showing this slide one time down in the Piganis, because I'm married into the Blood tribe. I'm part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. I was originally a member of Muskeg Lake in Saskatchewan, Treaty 6, but I married into the Blood tribe. Anyway, some of the elders at the Piganis said to me, "Oh, you still think of yourself as a poor Cree, you don't even paint your teepee." What can I say? Anyway, There we were before the day before treaty in our own teepees. And there was the crown that came to us. And I always tell young people, I do a lot of lecturing in schools in our communities about the significance of the teepee and the significance of where the treaties were made. Because the treaties were made, in Treaty 6, were made in Fort Carleton and in Fort Pitt. The crown came to us. We did not go to the crown. We did not make the treaties in Ottawa. Well, I don't think Ottawa even existed then. Maybe it did. As Mr. Pope said, who used to be John A. Macdonald's private secretary, called it a dirty little town. I think it's still a dirty little town. But anyway, the crown came to us. Why did the crown come to us? Because King George III in 1763 issued a royal proclamation. And the royal proclamation said 3 critical things. 1, that nobody of the crown's subjects can enter the territories of the Indian nations or tribes without an agreement or a treaty. 2, anybody of the crown's subjects who were in our territory where there was no agreement, the crown had the obligation to remove them from that territory. In other words, squatters out. The third thing, and this is the really important thing of the Royal Proclamation, that the crown may wish to enter into agreements with said Indian nations or tribes. That's the wording of the Royal Proclamation, Indian nations or tribes. Only if, this is the most important part, if the Indians so desire. This is significant because it's up to the Indians, and you hear all kinds of horror stories that have been concocted now by the colonizers, and they try to tell our children this, that, we're destitute, we're falling on our knees praying that they would help us, that we were so poor we couldn't do anything. And that's not what the historical record says. If you study the map of treaties 1 to 11, and you look where Treaty 1 and 2 are, does anybody know? Where's Treaty 1 and 2? Manitoba. Why is the Treaties 1 and 2 in Manitoba when they were coming from the east? Because they tried to make a treaty in the Lake of the Woods area, but the people said no. They said, go away, we'll think about it, we'll call you back. That's why you have 1, 2, 3, and then 4. Because they waited for 2 years in the Lake of the Wood area before they were prepared to enter into treaty. So when you talk about the Royal Proclamation, they wanted to enter into a treaty with the Indians in the Lake of the Woods, but the Lake of the Wood Indians said, no, we're not ready at this time to make that treaty. So if the Indians so desire, and this is a very important component, because when we sat with the treaty commissioner, not me personally, although Regina Crowchild will dispute that, she's constantly at meetings that her and I were at the time, we were there when the trees were making the treaties and we're looking over their shoulders. I have to report that's not true. Although she might have been there, I wasn't there. Anyway, so the crown came to us to make the treaty. And this is really important because what Canada was not there at the treaty table. It was the crown, represented by a Lieutenant Governor Alexander Morris, who had instructions from the crown to make the treaty. And he only had instructions to make a peace and friendship treaty, because even in his own words, he told the people that they didn't have enough money to buy the land. So here's what happened. On our side of the treaty, we have our own laws. our own government, our own territory. Everybody knows this. You know where your territories are. We have our own peoples. We had our own education system. We had our own health system. We had our own languages. And the most important thing, we had the ability to make agreements. Because prior to the Crown arriving here, we made treaties with other nations. We have a treaty with the Dene Nation. Everybody knows that. Especially if you're a Cree, you know that the Dene beat us 3 times. It's kind of an embarrassing thing, but as a Cree, you got to be honest. So we made a peace treaty with them. But that's why you have the Peace River, right? Because that's the demarcation line, the dividing line between the Crees and the Dene. But we also have a treaty. Now here's where I get confused. I'm either part of the Blackfoot Confederacy or I'm a Cree. Some chiefs say that it's convenient for me to be one or the other. It depends. I could be a Cree and I can also be Blackfoot. There's a treaty that was made at Wetaskiwin, right, between the Crees and the Blackfoot Confederacy for peace. And what they call the Red Deer River now, which is not really the Red Deer River, but anyway, whatever they call the Red Deer River now, is the dividing line between the Crees and the Blackfoot Confederacy. So we don't have a problem with these treaties. Although from time to time I tell my husband, you know, the treaty is very tenuous, you know, could break at any time. But I haven't actually done anything about that. But anyway, so we had, before the arrival of the non-Indigenous people, made treaties. We made treaties with the Lakota, we made treaties with the Nakalinawak, we made treaties with a lot of people. So we know about treaty making. So that's well encoded in our side of the TP. Over here on this side, the Crown, as I was talking about the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Canada was created in 1867 with the passage of the British North American Act. Canada did not exist before the passage of the British North American Act. Can anybody here tell me when your nation came into existence? Can you put a date on it? Can you? No, because we've always been here. This is our homeland. So they created this place called Canada without our consent. Without our consent. You have to remember that. They didn't ask us to create this place. And then they never made the treaties with us, but the Crown also created provinces. In 1905, they created Alberta and Saskatchewan. Again, they never asked us. In 1930, they transferred all the resources and lands from our territory to the province, again, without asking us. And as what Cameron was saying earlier, in 1925, the Department of Indian Affairs under Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs, was really angry about something that happened in Geneva. There was a man named Daskate, who was a member of the Haudenosaunee. He went to Geneva to the League of Nations, and he wanted to address the League of Nations as a nation. At that time, Canada was not a member of the League of Nations, because Canada was not a fully functioning state or within the international world. So they were sitting behind Great Britain, sort of like, you know, like when you go to ceremonies and you're supposed to sit behind the old people. That was Canada. Anyway, Daskate in Geneva got France, the Netherlands, and the Danes and the Germans to agree that Daskate could address the League of Nations in his own right. Well, you can imagine what happened. Canada threw a hissy fit, is best described, a hissy fit, cried to Mother England that these Indians should not be allowed to address the League of Nations. And so Great Britain put a lot of pressure on these other countries to withdraw the invitation for him to address the League of Nations, which they did. But then Canada went one step further. They changed the Indian Act in Canada that said no people, more than 3 people, this would be an illegal gathering under the changes to the Indian Act. No more than 3 people together would constitute an illegal meeting, 1. 2, Indians were not allowed to raise monies to hire a lawyer. And there's cases that I know of where Indians tried to hire lawyers and Indian Affairs came down on them and said, if you represent those Indians, you're going to get disbarred. And the other thing that they did is they changed the ability of the functioning of your governments. And they tried to remove the traditional councils from the governments and move them into something that they could manage. That was Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs, did that in retaliation to what Descartes did in Geneva in 1923-24. So they have a very long history of being afraid of Indians, is the best thing I can say. So this whole thing here of the separation, so what's Canada trying to do now? What are they trying to do? What they're trying to do is they're trying to get our people to agree that all the things that are underneath the teepee and many more, to move them over here underneath the British North American Act or under Canada or under the provincial system. And they're getting you to give up your right by saying this is for your people. So let's talk about that. So here's an example of the 10-year grant funding. And I heard when I came in here this morning, I heard the presentation saying that the, what do they call them, BISC, whatever they call themselves now, they're the ones that have the money. But that department is going to disappear. Think about that. You're funded for different things from the government of Canada, which we have a affidavit signed and sworn by an associate deputy minister of the government saying that the monies that are allocated from Treasury Board for Indians are based on a legal obligation. The government, without asking us, took those monies and gave it to this Bisquick government department without asking us. And now they're telling you quite openly, I heard this morning, that this is going to disappear. So the legal obligations of the funding are going to disappear. They can't. The government will say, you were told. You were given fair warning. 2020, they told you. Cold Lake, they told you it's going to disappear. So what do they have what do they have planned for you? They have the 10-year grant. And if you analyze a 10-year grant, which I have done, every section, every page of the 68 pages, including all the schedules, what does a 10-year grant do? The 10-year grant is you agreeing to come under their jurisdiction in all areas, including the application now of moving towards grant-funded. Excuse me, I'm going to have a drink of water. And what they've done in this process is, I think in 2005, some time ago, the government enacted this First Nations Fiscal Management Act. Treaty Indians objected to this. They said, we don't accept this legislation. We don't like this legislation. It's a violation of our treaties. And the government people said, oh, don't worry about this. This legislation is an opt-in, opt-out legislation. You can opt into the legislation if you want. You don't have to. That was 2003. But if you look at the 10-year grant and you analyze it, you have no choice now. You have to go into it. Because you've got to produce a financial act. And what is it called? Financial administrative, what's it called? Financial administrative something or other. I couldn't figure out what the heck this was. I thought in the 10-year grant document, I thought it was referring to this legislation. It's not referring to this legislation. It's referring to the board that the government created and pays for these people in West Vancouver or North Vancouver, somewhere in Vancouver. They created a First Nations grant, or First Nations Finance Law. So, oh yeah, that's what it's called, FAL, First Nations Finance, or Administrative Law, FAL. It's in the 10-year grant. So it's this group in Vancouver that created this law, the template. You're supposed to agree to this template in order to qualify for the grants. So this was a little bit tricky because when you look at the legislation, the 10-year grant, it talks about nations with revenue and nations without revenue. So if you got revenue, there's certain criteria that apply. If you don't have revenue, then there's certain criteria that don't apply. But this is all developed by this little group that's being paid by Ottawa in Vancouver. I think it's in North Vancouver. Anyway, they're over there drafting all this stuff, and then Indian Affairs is carrying it across the country, saying you want money, this is what you got to do. And then the interesting thing about all this is their view of the Indian Act. Because their view of the Indian Act is we're doing you a favor by getting rid of the Indian Act. That's what they try to tell you. We're all lightness and merriment. We're spreading lightness and joy among the people across the country. We're going to get rid of the Indian Act for you. I'm not bragging, the foremost expert on the Indian Act. I indexed all the provisions of the Indian Act from 1864 to 1976, every section. I indexed it. Department of Justice lawyers, I'd like to slap them, but constantly tell me what a great resource it is that I did this index, because it helps them greatly in the litigation that they're involved in, which makes me completely crazy, because I didn't do it for them, I did it for our people, so we understand what's in the provisions of the Indian Acts. But anyway, so they're telling you now lightness and we're spreading joy amongst the Indians. We're getting rid of the Indian Act. You got two problems with that scenario, which I didn't hear anybody this morning saying to you that how we're going to deal with them. One, in 1876, without our consent, the government put our reserved lands into the Indian Act. Reserved lands, Iskungana, into the Indian Act without our consent. Except in there it says that our lands retain the same character as they did before the passage of this act, which means they're sovereign lands. So they put them in the Indian Act. So you get rid of the Indian Act, you get rid of your reserved lands. That's one. The other provision that you should think about very seriously is the issue of taxation. Right now, it's in the Indian Act that says that you don't pay taxes if you live on the reserve or you have goods and services delivered to the reserve. So lightness and joy that's being spread by Indian Affairs fails to mention these two key points. And you get rid of the funding out of Bisquick. What do you have then? Magigwe. So you have to think about that, because if you see how they're doing this, they go from the First Nations Fiscal Management Act to this Financial Administration Law, the FAL. The The Indian Act provides the financial administration bylaws provisions, which now you have to move into getting an FAL. Then you have to go into financial performances. Well, everybody has to go through those, right? They do this whole thing about, you know, are you a competent First Nation to receive money from them, when they don't talk about their own incompetence in the spending of money. But it's all directed at the Indians because Indians are not competent spenders of money. Do you know how many reports that people write in order to get money, even a little bit of money from the government? It's unbelievable. What about the people that get huge grants or loans from the government and never have to report on any of it? I'm talking about non-Indigenous entities. Look at their PayPal, whatever they call that system that they created, billions of dollars, and there's hundreds of employees that are still not getting funded from their own public servants. But they gave that company all kinds of money. Did they account for what they did with it? No. What about all these other contracts that they have squandered money about? You know, they only have this accountability heaped on our shoulders, not them. So then you have this assessment board where we're trying to assess whether or not you're eligible, and then you get into this 10-year grant. What's at the end of the 10-year grant? What you go into the 10-year grant, what is going to be funded after the 10-year grant? There's no answers. You ask them. Well, it depends on whether or not we can get a Treasury Board minute to continue the funding. Ask the BC Indians when they took over health care almost 10 years ago, what's going to happen to them. Because the government of Canada's justice lawyers sitting at a meeting in Ottawa, and the justice lawyer says, we no longer have any obligation legal obligation to the Indians in British Columbia on health care. And so they're going to fall into the provincial hands or into who knows where. So that's the 10-year grant. So what does this mean for you? They created this Department of Indigenous Services. They did not tell us or ask us, do we want this? They created it through an order in council. That's a cabinet order. At the end of August, when everybody's on holidays, in 2018, or 2017, or is it 18? I can't remember some time ago. They never engaged our nations at all. And what does this mean? And then they did something they took the monies that were legally given to the Department of Indian Affairs from Treasury Board, and they took those monies and they gave them to this other entity created by an order in council. This is a fundamental constitutional change within the government of Canada. And they never engaged us one time about this. I'm not afraid of baby Trudeau. I wasn't afraid of Papa Trudeau, and I'm not afraid of baby Trudeau. Because I think I'm one of the few people in this room who was actually there in 1969, right? How many people were around in 1969? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You know, 1969, the old people took on the government about why did they do that? Because of the land. Because Papa Trudeau was talking about getting rid of the land, getting rid of 9124 lands Indians and lands reserved for Indians. They wanted to do away with the Indian Act, do away with the Indians, do away with our lands. And that was in '69. So this is a very similar process that's going on here. So what they did is that they created this process, and they took the monies, the legally, what they call legal obligation monies, they took it from Diane and to this other entity that they created through an order in council by a constitutional amendment. And this is something that never got discussed in Canada, never got discussed by any legal thinkers about it. But when the chiefs raised this issue in the standing committee in Ottawa, because for a year and a half, the government did not engage in anything. They did not have a legal basis for what they were doing except through these orders and councils. And orders and councils are limited to what they can do. They have a very short life, except that Canada extended the order and councils to more than a year. But what they did is in this spring, embedded in a 900-plus budget bill, they put in Division 25. And they legally created BISQUIC now, or whatever they're calling it. And you have to read the legislation, because it says that the purpose of the creation of this department, the purpose is to gradually transfer all their authority to organizations. So you have to be very concerned about what they've done with that. They've also made amendments to the financial administration law. I just realized it's 5 to 12. And they're changing the concept of what's in the contribution agreements, forcing the First Nations into these 10-year grants. So then forcing First Nations into legislation that people never agreed to it to begin with. So I'm just going to go to the next slide. I took too long here. This is the legislation of C31, C3, S3. There's a very simple solution to all this process. We're Treaty Indians. And up until 1951, we controlled our citizenship list. The amendments to the Indian Act in 1951 created statutory Indians. There was no statutory Indians before 1951. Those of you who were born before September the 4th, 1951, you were born a Treaty Indian. Those of you that are born after September 4th, 1951, you are a statutory Indian. Hi, Chief. You were a statutory Indian. What does that mean? That means the government can repeal the legislation that creates you, and you disappear tomorrow. That's what it means. On the other hand, I am a Treaty Indian because I was born before September 4th, 1951. I'm a very old person, by the way. Not as old as Regina, but, I'm old. So what the government is doing is they themselves are getting you to administer your demise, for you to get rid of yourselves. And then they can stand back with clean hands and say, it wasn't us, we tried to help them, they just couldn't be managed, they made all these mistakes, and so we had to clean it up. Because if you look at the funding, I think there's a First Nation in this area that I think, not going to tell too many tales, but there are schools that have children who are not recognized, and the nation has to provide they want to provide funding for those children, but they're legally prohibited from providing monies for children who are not recognized by the government. Let's put it that way. So they are forcing you to make decisions, and those children that are not recognized and are being born can't be registered in the future, they cannot apply for housing, they cannot apply for education, they cannot apply for health care, they can't apply for anything. And so the lands will become vacated, and you'll be like what happened with, there was a chief in southern Alberta where they just took away the land. They said, well, there's nobody living here anymore, so we'll just take away the land. So that disappeared. So I'm just going to go quickly through this. The Child Welfare Act, that whatever they call it now. This act came into effect on the 1st of January 2020. The biggest problem with this legislation is that you will be forced in your First Nation to negotiate those agreements with each jurisdiction where your children may be residing. First of all, you got to negotiate with the government, because you got to, first of all, pass a Child Welfare Act that complies with the standards that the government sets. And then this is a template that they created from C31. And then once you draft the law, you submit it to Canada, into the federal system, and then the federal system will agree or not agree that you have a child welfare right, and then you can start negotiating with the provinces where your children are. I'm telling you, 99.9% of you will not have the funds or the negotiating team to do that. Because I'm almost 100% sure that the provinces already have these agreements in place, and they're ready for you when you try to sit down with them. You'll probably not have the legal capacity to do it, and they will run over you with their process. So, and there's no money. And until recently, there was no minister in charge of this legislation. And the legislation came into effect on January the 1st. This Mr. Miller, who is now the minister apparently in charge of this, says, well, I missed the cutoff for Treasury Board submission for funding. So we might have monies in this process in 2021, 2022. But 2021, no monies for that. So anyway, then they have the same issues with the language bill. This legislation really codifies really what the government has been doing from the beginning, the government of Canada, which is to get rid of the languages of the Indigenous nations. This was the purpose of the residential schools. This was what they imposed by the churches or the schools to get rid of the language. And in the language, if you cannot provide and converse in your language, an element of your nationhood has disappeared, going back to under the TP. And the thing about this is that AFN, as an organization which did not make treaties, cooperated in the creation of this legislation, with or without the consent of the chiefs. They didn't have the consent, but they manufactured their consent. And then the new legislation that you have to watch out for, and this will be the last thing I'll talk about, is this whole issue of pharmacare. You hear it across the country. They're going to have a national drug plan. Well, who loses out on the national drug plan? Treaty peoples, especially Treaty 6. Because we have the medicine chest. Oh, here I am. Now I'm a Cree in Treaty 6. You see how easy it is for me to slide into that? Chief Lewis from Onion Lake always says to me, very convenient for you. One day you're a Cree, next day you're a Kainai. But anyway, but Treaty 6 has the medicine chest. If you have pharmacare across the country, everybody is going to have access to health or pharmacy. Just look at what happened in British Columbia. They went into pharmacare in 2018, or in January the 1st, 2018. And they started cutting access for medicines. In June of 2019, people that were newly diagnosed as diabetic in Indians will not receive any funding or medicine from this program in British Columbia because they're running out of money. So what's going to happen across the country, they make us all the same, which means that we lose our right. And then there's the Education Act that they had previously introduced. We fought it, they withdrew it, and now there's going to be there's discussion about it being reintroduced. They're really amping up the Land Management Act, which is the individual ownership of lands within the reserved lands. which then allows them to create and to promote the taxation. Manny Jules and his crew to move in on taxation. You should all pay taxes. And then they're moving the Self-Government Act, which is moved by TAG, Treaty on Aboriginal Government, which is under the infamous Joe Wild, so under Caroline Bennett when she's sober. So I always tell people, do not meet with Bennett after lunch. If she meets with you after lunch, anything she says, not worth anything. Somebody told me in Ontario that they had a meeting, and she said, yes, I'm with you 100% right behind you. And I said, can I ask you a question? What time was that meeting? And she said, it was like, I don't know, late afternoon. I said, what she told you is just rubbish. It'll never work, because she was too drunk to remember what she said. Anyway, so these are things you have to keep an eye on. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. I don't know if anybody has any questions, maybe. I don't know, Chief. I'll give you 10 minutes. Anybody have any questions? Yes?
I just have a point about Bill S-92 with the Child Welfare Act. With Bill S-92 under the Child Welfare Act, it's now being legislated, and it's put underneath the guise of this control through the provinces and enabling the nations to get control of their children. What people fail to recognize and realize is that we actually are going to be stuck in a situation where it was just mentioned that there's more child in care now than there were during residential school. Well, there's been a lot of lawsuits with now our grandparents and our parents and some people around younger than me that actually were in residential school or have been disconnected from their nations, loss of language and everything. So there was a liability put on the shoulders of the government. Now that liability, with the signing of this in January 1, now rests with your nations, because your nations have control of who their children are going to be delivered to. If they remain within the nation, you keep your children. However, you have to find the funding to enable them to be part of your nation, to stay there, to set up a group home or however it wants to be implemented. Unfortunately, when you talk liability, we're talking these lawsuits. It's going to come down now to the nations, because Canada has just washed their hands of it. So that's what I wanted to share with you. And people, it wasn't brought forward with that. Joe Wild and all of their crew there, they're not bringing any of that forward, because it's, you guys are asking for this? Here, we'll give it to you. But now, we still have a lot of kids in care. Where are they going to come back to? You know, we don't have much space. Chief Cam was speaking about that. He says we have limited amounts of lands. However, Sharon will contest this, is that we actually, all the lands, that's what they're trying to do. In '69 they tried to do that. They wanted to take and have us sign over the lands. If you look at them trying to move it into different areas, for instance, like parkland, when they convert it to parkland, they can turn around and do that. We were fortunate that just before this happened, that other government was trying to do that. It kind of got shut down. But right now, we're sitting there in a funding crisis. And this new premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, is not giving any kind of monies out to anybody. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you. But be very aware with that new act that just came in for the child welfare. Hi.
Thank you. Question? Yeah.
Hi everybody, my name is Hinto Che Nagluk Mervyn Grambo. According to their Adjudicator Act, it says equity prevails over common law. They follow common law. Our land is our equity. Last year, Justin Trudeau admitted that he or Canada does not have title to our land. Without land, you cannot make laws about land or the original people of that land. They're making our chiefs and council create election law, human rights issue, adopted peoples. Who decides? Court dictated to us again. Blood quantum is a part of making horses eligible to run in a horse race. Becoming Canadian, none of us are Canadian. We are what we are born as. Like me, I am Dennis Huxlene. Others are Cree, Saulteaux, but others are born Huron, Mohawk, Blood, or Blackfoot. Canada has no jurisdiction over our original peoples. So what do the governments of corporate Canada think they are doing, making laws that we have to follow? Used to be a C, but there is still D, E, and F in something he said. How can there be D, E, and F when their C has been cut out? What the heck do you mean past status? We are treaty people, not status. You can't tell us we are status when we are born treaty. We were born on this land. Our people didn't come on the original boat. We are not boat people. Canadian court has no jurisdiction to make laws pertaining to us original peoples. Canada needs to go back to the beginning, not to your laws. These are propaganda to make our people forget who we are. We, the government, you, the government, have no jurisdiction to use your laws. Telling us is not what we want or told we want. Only one original people has no right to make decisions over the rest of us. How much does it cost to bring someone like you to attend these meetings? Aren't you paid to do your job already? How much did our chief and council get paid to get you here? That is double dipping according to your laws. We are not citizens. We are tribal members. As you said up here, citizen is a whole new meaning. So none of us are citizens of this country. We are tribal members on this land. Masi.
Okay, we're past the break for lunch, but if there's one more question, then Chief?
Could you go back right? Which one you didn't put at the bottom?
First slide?
Go back to
It's just a second.
Towards the end.
I'm the worst person with computers, so it's amazing that I actually managed to produce a PowerPoint, so that was a big deal.
I did have a question, Sharon. About that, you mentioned about that group that in Vancouver. If they set that in place, will that be implemented with everybody?
That's the way the 10-year grant has been constructed, yes. And apparently it was drafted, according to the people in the government, they said to us that this 10-year template was drafted with the full cooperation of the Assembly of First Nations and these other people that work in these areas. So they, they just don't tell the nations what they're doing. And so then all of a sudden you're hit with these documents. And even to do an analysis of the 10-year grant, it took us, probably about 4 days of working 10 hours a day going through it.
Oh, I can't see.
Oh, sorry.
Number six. Right there. One more.
What was it pertaining to?
5 or 4?
I don't know. What is it? What is it about, Terry?
It's towards the end, I guess, last year.
Next one over.
What about those?
This is the last slide.
Yeah, that's right.
That's okay. 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 Thank you very much for asking me to come. I really appreciate it. And the slideshow is going to be this PowerPoint is available up here with the technical people. You can get a copy of it. If you have a memory stick, it can download it for you. Thank you.
So once again, thank you very much, Sharon. So on behalf of TCVI, the Board of Chiefs, the staff, the elders.